So a few weeks ago we discussed Marines from the Expanse and the way infantry are deployed in the Expanse universe, and I talked a lot about them being used to defend ships that were being boarded, but I figured today we could talk a little bit about the other side. Let's talk about how exactly you board a spacecraft, specifically in the Expanse, but a lot of this will apply to other methods of science fiction as well. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So, in the Expanse, boarding is a significant portion of space combat, but still not nearly as large as direct ship-to-ship combat that we see primarily, whether it's via PDCs or long-range torpedoes. Boarding is still a key element in naval strategy within the universe of the Expanse, so it's definitely worth discussing, but it's not a primary means for combat between military forces. That being said, let's dive into exactly how it's done, and let's start with the basics. Exactly as boarding a ship, for those who don't know. It basically means you're getting infantry from your vessel onto an enemy vessel, and there's a few ways of doing that, and that's where things get really interesting, is how exactly you move troops from one ship to another, especially in the heat of combat. Now, the way I see it, there are two primary methods for boarding an enemy vessel. One is logistically simpler, but tactically more difficult. The other is tactically simpler, but logistically more complicated. So we'll start with the one that's the most simple. If you've disabled an enemy vessel by destroying its engines and its weapons, you can simply pull up alongside of it and extend a docking tunnel. We see this used semi-frequently by OPA pirates and non-governmental organizations, since this is far cheaper than the alternative. And while the OPA definitely uses the other option that we'll talk about a little bit later, this one is the simplest. It's just a docking tube connecting two vessels, and a breaching team breaching the enemy vessel's airlock and proceeding from there. It is worth noting that we don't see this one very often because, once again, this one requires the hostile vessel to be immobilized and defenseless. If that hostile vessel has functional weapon systems, they can simply shoot the boarding vessel before they can get close enough to initiate that docking lock. And by the way, during the process of docking, the assaulting vessel is going to be extremely vulnerable to weapons fire. So it's really not something you could do in an active combat zone or when you're facing an adversary who has not been disabled. That's where the other method of boarding an enemy vessel comes in, and that's breaching pods. Now, like I said, breaching pods are going to be tactically simpler but more logistically complicated. The engineering behind making basically a dedicated spacecraft designed to burrow its way into an enemy vessel and clear a hole for your troops to enter that vessel from, and do so in a relatively airtight manner, is an incredibly complex engineering task. Most of these breaching pods latch onto the vessel using large hooks before burrowing a hole the exact size and shape of an airlock assembly in the breaching pod, allowing them to basically create a sealed opening that's likely filled with some sort of rubber O-ring type apparatus that prevents any leaks, or at least minimizes any leaks, while troops pass through the breach that the breaching pod has made. This pod, by the way, has to work almost like its own spacecraft, with its own propulsion and navigation systems to allow it to move through space and successfully engage the vessel they've been targeted to attack. Once latched onto an enemy vessel with the hole cut, a door on the breaching pod can open, and enemy troops can simply walk from the breaching pod into the enemy vessel. Now, there are some key downsides. Like I said, this is an incredibly complex means of deploying troops. On top of that, a breaching pod can only carry as many troops as you can physically fit in the pod, where if you have a docking tunnel, you theoretically have the entire Marine complement of the vessel carrying out the boarding operation, where, once again, with these breaching pods, they can hold maybe a dozen troops each, meaning that you either need a large number of them, or you need to hope that your enemy vessel is not very well defended on the inside. Now, the big advantage to breaching pods is that you don't have to immobilize an enemy vessel at all. You can fling them en masse at an enemy vessel, and a few of them will hit. Now, the downside is ones that miss or get shot down means a lot of troops lost, but you don't necessarily need to disable weapons or engines to get a clean boarding with boarding pods, or these breaching pods. That makes them far more suitable for situations where there's still an active battle going on, especially since the vessel deploying the boarding teams can sort of release them and then focus on the rest of the battle while the infantry in the boarding pods deal with the engagement they're involved in. Now, while breaching pods are more complex and as a result are the primary go-to for large military organizations like the MCRN and the UNN, they aren't exclusive to those factions, and we actually do see the OPA deploying breaching pods at least a few times. The most interesting, by the way, would be these modified shipping containers turned into breaching pods used by OPA forces during the Battle of Thoth Station. But now that you have your infantry on an enemy vessel, you now have another logistical problem. How do you keep them supplied? Now, once again, with the docking tunnel, it's as simple as carrying supplies through that docking tunnel. But if you're using these breaching pods, you end up with an interesting conundrum, where how do you resupply your troops that are now in an active firefight on an enemy vessel? Well, the most likely and practical solution is to dedicate a portion of those breaching pods to carrying supplies for reserve operations. That's going to be ammunition, weapons, and medical supplies to maintain active combat operations on an enemy vessel. Furthermore, you could order your breaching party to prioritize disabling ship systems to allow that secondary form of boarding to take place, where, say, the breach pod soldiers deployed via the breaching pods manage to disable the weapons and engineering on the vessel and allow it to be immobilized, which then makes it available for that docking maneuver that would allow a hard docking connection between two vessels in a combat scenario. But at that point, we're getting pretty hypothetical, and I don't think we ever actually see that in the Expanse. And if you even get your boarding troops through to an enemy vessel, you have to contend with their local complement of Marines, which could be just a handful of soldiers, or it could be a much larger unit like on a Doniger-class battleship. If you'd like to learn about how Marines are deployed in the Expanse, I'll leave a link up here to my video on that, talking about the role infantry combat plays within that universe. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments which boarding method you think was most effective. Just pulling up alongside an enemy vessel and creating a hard docking tube, or deploying breaching pods, which has more tactical flexibility. And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in the Expanse or anywhere else in science fiction, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.